I want to welcome everybody to the event tonight that we organized around celebrating Ellsworth Kelly's 90th birthday. So we're going to kick off the event tonight by having a panel discussion on American abstraction since Ellsworth Kelly, moderated by Rob STORR. Rob's been the Dean of the Yale School of Art since 2006. He's been the chairman of FAPE'S Professional Fine Arts Committee. And he doesn't know this, but I've been the beneficiary of his scholarship over the years. When he was at MoMA, I remember the Tony Smith retrospective, one of my favorite artists, and the Robert Ryman retrospective. And then, as many people know, he was the first American to be given the task to lead the Venice Biennale in 2007. And with that, let me turn it over to Rob, who's going to introduce our panelists and moderate the discussion.
This is an event sponsored by FAPE, which is an extraordinary program about which I think you probably all know some. But it is a program in which work by living American artists is placed in American embassies around the world so that people who come to do business there, people who come to negotiate treaties there, so people who work there, who stand guard there, so all the people associated with these buildings will have something to think about that is not politics and not diplomacy, but is in fact an expression of the many kinds of art made in this country by the many kinds of people who make it up. It's a very simple proposition, but it's remarkable how effectively it works. And it works based primarily on the generosity of those who support the programs by contributing both works of art and money to follow through on commissions, and then very much by those people who contribute their talents and time, meaning the artists. This is a program which relies to an extraordinary extent on artists giving for this program without any kind of recompense at all. As we all know, artists, to, I think, the shame of the IRS, can take no tax deductions for what they give. So that when an artist gives a work of art, it is an extraordinary gesture, and also time is precious to artists. So when artists give time, it's an extraordinary gesture. And the artists in this program, all of whom on the panel are represented by people who are actually doing this or have done it, have done something really exceptional. And we owe them a debt of thanks. And it is something that I think is to the benefit of everybody who encounters these works in these circumstances. So that's just the preamble. This is an occasion because Ellsworth Kelly is 90. And Ellsworth Kelly proves that there are not only second acts in American lives, but third, fourth, fifth, and sixth acts. And that they're all good. And that it is possible to keep moving, keep being fresh, keep engendering new art. Once upon a time, there was a comment made by Harold Rosenberg, who was asked, well, what is quality in contemporary art? And he said, it's freshness. You know it when you see it, and something fresh is fresh. And that's a case, again, here. All of the artists here are making work which has that freshness, which is something that is really immediately perceptible, tangible, that communicates, and that is, of course, a great accomplishment, because like, Fred Astaire, making it look that good and making it look easy is the hardest thing in the world. And so that's another dimension to this. Now, we're celebrating Ellsworth with this event, but it is also about the artists who are here, who I'll introduce in just one moment, and it's about their work, and it's about how they think about the long-term project of abstract art, of which they are exemplars. Abstraction was, depending upon your art historical calculator, invented someplace around 1906, 1907. And as soon as it was invented, there were people who were predicting that it would die, that figuration would come back and conquer it. And then thereafter, there were people who thought that not only should it die, but it should die a noble death by falling on its Roman sword, because abstraction would be the end of art in a positive way, as if such a thing could be. But again, Ellsworth's life is a trajectory of how much vitality abstract art has had by dint of his efforts and other people who simply didn't buy into those ideas. And by the way, given Ellsworth's work, who didn't buy into the idea that abstraction was the mortal adversary of figuration. That is an idea of the mid-20th century, maybe a little bit earlier even, in the 20s certainly. But a great many people who make abstract art make art that also has images in it. Sometimes those images are culled from our environment. Ellsworth himself draws, and draws beautifully, and draws things, and draws people, and draws plants, and so on. So we're at a very good moment to sort of think about abstraction not as something that has peaked or will nobly kill itself off or anything like that, but as a thriving enterprise shared by many artists doing it for many different reasons and doing it in many different ways. And that really abstraction is the prime example of how pluralism in art is not a negative thing but a positive thing, because if that many people can tap into that kind of a project and come up with this many really interesting things, we are all the better for it. So with that as a sort of general preamble, we're going to have a film briefly that was made by Checkerboard Foundation that will show a little bit about Ellsworth. We will then, I will introduce the panelists right now, and then each one of them will speak to their own interests, to their own concerns. They're here to talk about their work, their way of approaching it. Then I like to call myself not a moderator, but an immoderator. I will try and stir it up a little bit so that we can have a conversation about the things that come up in their statements and the things that they have to say to each other. I fully license them, and they will not even wait for my license, to jump in and interrupt the conversation and say it anyway. And then at a certain point, when we've sort of done that part of it, we can open it to the room to a few questions or comments. So that's kind of the program for this evening. The important thing is that all of these people are doing this in recognition of each other. And this is as close as you'll get in New York these days to an actual community of artists in a public situation. So I think that we should enjoy that. We should keep it simple, informal, and substantive. And with that, the first artist is Lynda Benglis. Can you stand up just so people can see you in the back? Is that possible? Okay, well, wait. It's Lynda Benglis, who has a project which is at the US-UN delegation building and other things in the works. There is Frank Stella, who contributed a print to this program early on. There's Julie MEHRETU, who is in the process of working on a print. And there's ODILI, Donald ODITA, who has made a project which is on 2 floors of the US-UN building, an in-situ mural. So with that as the introductions to the cast of characters, we will go to the film, and then we will proceed.
Oh, maybe that's it there. Bonjour, madame.
C'est pour quoi faire?
Quand j'étais un étudiant,
Oui,
ici, il y a 50 ans,
oui.
je restais à l'hôtel Bertillon et je mettais mon bicyclette dans le cours.
Faire une photo de là.
Pour 2 minutes seulement.
2 minutes parce que c'est
Oui, c'est ça.
Bon,
Oui.
allez-y.
Bon, très bien, merci. Merci bien.
La faites vite alors. Hein?
Oui. I would come in and I loved the design of those 2 relief pieces. See that wall with those 2 chimneys? I can show you a photo that I took of it. There were 3 such walls in different parts of Paris that I put together into one painting, which I called Ormesson. Merci, madame.
When you see a painting by Ellsworth Kelly, on the first view you cannot connect it with anything around you. But you can understand very well in the Paris years how he built his abstraction on looking at reality. Of course, the most famous or obvious example was this window of the Museum of Modern Art.
I went to the Museum of Modern Art. They were showing an artist with paintings this big, and they were all lined up on the walls. And I looked at the big windows, which were like 15 feet. And I just kept looking at it and saying, I prefer the windows. I want to have it. So I made a replica. It's about this high. And that was my first panel picture. You know, over there in the corner, that's where we sat when I visited him back in 1950. He sat here, and we sat next to him, and he talked to us and explained these photographs. He was dressed in a white outfit with a white cap. He seemed very happy to have us visit him. I think he showed us this. I have a yellow painting that I did in the early 60s. That's just, it's flat, of course, very plainer, but it's like the figure 8. And I did a sculpture later that was exhibited in the Tuileries Gardens.
Ellsworth is a very methodical maker of things. He is somebody who starts with intuitions and perceptions of unique things that are in the world. Step 2 is actually to begin to work it as a drawing or as a scrap of some kind. And there are sketchbooks where you can see a single curve or a single shape reiterated over and over and over again. So he's grasped something out there, brought it here, focused down on it, moved it around. The variations in facture are quite large in relation to this primary identification of what a shape will be and how its edge will be aligned.
The process is first Ellsworth building a model of the room and then doing a scale model of the work. Probably the first thing we do then is establish color. This is the original sample that Ellsworth sent us to match, and this is the result of our matching process. One difference, this is an opaque paint where you're looking at the surface. This is a transparent ink where you're looking through the color to a white surface. And so there's a little bit of compromise done. His color acuity is just extremely well developed, and he can just see it instantly if you've got it or not. The amazing part is that you don't see the surface. The surface becomes a plane of color, and your eye either drops in, you fall through that plane, or you notice it in its totality of a form. But your eye doesn't get caught on the surface.
The content is in the looking at it. This is about the amount of two colors, one on top of the other. And the wall, too. The wall is, that's the third element. They do entertain me. You know, I mean, you can sit here and look at it and sort of breathe it in.
Now, ODILI has graciously agreed to kick off, and that's what he will do.
I want to thank everybody for coming out. It's really a great honor to be here and to be here with all these other artists and with Rob STORR and to be invited here by FAPE at Christie's. It's fantastic. I had the great opportunity of speaking on behalf of Ellsworth's work at the Barnes Foundation earlier this year in the summer. I learned quite a lot doing some research on the work, and I'm very happy to be here now to continue the celebration of Ellsworth and his 90th year here. My work is about color. It uses color as a tool. What I'm trying to do specifically is to speak of difference. And I want to speak of difference on many different levels. I'm concerned with essentially the idea of space, the body, of time, geography in essence. But I'm using color to be able to investigate these things on an intellectual level as well as an emotional level. Color is something that's fascinating to me in the sense that you can see it in so many different ways. You can see it as a space in the sense of coloring, giving color to a space, and then as an emotional condition or an emotional consideration. And then I take it into a more philosophical, social sense and apply it to the idea of the body and the idea of difference in the body, so that you have, say, skin types or body types. And we may be able to, one hand, look at these types as the same thing, but in fact, they're different in so many ways. And so I'm interested in nuance and the difference between, say, one blue versus another blue and what that creates when they come together within a space. And then on top of that, in the paintings, I'm interested in color within an actual space and how that transforms not only the mind, but the body. And what it's done for me is to be able to see how painting as an individual object actually encompasses space in and of itself. It's not just something that's singular on a wall, hung on a nail, but in fact can enhance the way we engage a space. And that's what I understood with looking over at Ellsworth. That's what I understood in his project and how he went towards this aspect of reaching the monumental, of speaking to the notion of monument, and how he understood that as a time memorial situation where we are engaged as people with these edifices in our world in ways that connect us all together, in ways that bring us through time from the past into the present and in the future. So for me, it's amazing with my work how I'm able to understand at least that aspect of what you engaged in your work earlier on, and what you still engage with in a really profound way. And for me, space is a cultural thing, it's a social thing, it's a time thing, it's personal, it's emotional, historic. And I'm just trying to continue my investigation and potential of what color can do to enhance my awareness and the awareness of others that come into the spaces that I create.
Good. And Julie, would you like to sort of kick the ball in another
Sure.
direction?
First, I would just, I'm rolling too. I would just like to say it's a complete honor and humbling to be here on the panel with Frank Stella and Lynda Benglis in honor of Ellsworth Kelly and here with ODILI. And so I'm just start with that. I just am going to read some notes, and I have these images that are rolling that I wrote in the last year. Push, scratch, mark, cut, stay. A mark, a scratch, the sound of graphite on paper, ink gliding out of nib pulled by fibers in the paper, on the surface of acrylic, like stone, like parchment, never tabula rasa, always palimpsest. When drawing, pull out of myself, lose place, go deep into a pressurized state of disfiguration, disembodiment, lose all sense of cultural self, get lost inside a beat, inside a sonic pulsing system of half-links, half-consciousness, half-wit, find the break. The hand equals an instrument, device. The hand, the wrist, the gesture, flow, play, spit. The hand can throw a bomb. Get at the strangeness of the future image experience rather than habitually view and decipher. Sensory experience, emergent sensile form, tactile, acoustic, lingual, sensatory, auditory, haunting knowledge, premonition, draw faster, last chance, oral clue. Studio equals a machine, super, super loud of beats, breaks, compression, digestion. Serve intuition, impulse, improvisation, which equals enlightenment, cognition, symptomatic. Emergence of something new, from bits of now, past, place, data, mark, detritus, architectural parts, diagrammatic language, maps, lines, shapes, color, hue, synth, tempo, sonic, mutant, pressure, collapse time, mind for resources, for parts to a future. Refusing past tendencies, past actions that manifest into repeat patterns, repeat social actions, repeat repression, expansion of power, take the parts without judgment, break it, fuse it with marks, the creation of something other, a physical, sensorial image that is a time-based, emergent experience. Find the break, the gap, the fissures, undoing and pulling apart, open force of unraveling potentiality. Improvisation can be radical possibility. Painting is performative time. The marks are percussive, repetitive motions, marks that shift with each motion, faster, accelerating, to gain that wicked mass of marks being that devour, consume, digest, and decimate their place, until they morph it, shift it, fuse it, splice through it, fuse into it, splice through it, to find the break in the linear. The mark is insistent. It is individual, this, or could be in parentheses, individual active descent. The map equals nonsense, entropy, sublime. Prove it futile as the marks themselves. The battle of the small mark in this long view of time, layered and suspended into a long view back into the painting, all suspended in transparency, in the medium, in paint, desire. There's a compression of time, space, future, past, action, inaction. Dualities and contradictions forced into one suspended time moment, splicing them together, which equals mutant. The painting is performance in making and seeing and looking. The emergence of monstrosity. To look forward, the bits, the data, infrastructure, symbols of power, solder them onto the new machine, fuse the parts with marks that come and try to form something else legible, but descend into their illegibility. The marks are comfortable with that. They create the headache. Conjure ghosts and parts, detritus data. The drawing has become tired, loose, mimicking writing but not words. The new drawing has evolved out of depth of past paintings into the surface, seeping over a layered, stratified past. It has morphed into new disruptions in the surface image. The marks now drip, smear, paint, stain the machine as it is scored, fused into the surface from above or emerging from within. The marks are convective. They cluster, clog, strain under and in the machine, infecting its coherence, its machinations. The marks are contagion, contamination, the fallout. Stratagem. The language has loosened, blank notational. Opacity equals radical potential, improvisation, which equals possible clarity. Everything falls apart.
Thank you.
Something.
I'm going to do a little.
Read that fine print. When I was first straining my neck to look at around, the first piece looked like of Julie's. Somehow it had a lot of, and the other things did too, a lot of echoes of Lascaux. And when Rob was so worried about abstraction might not last long, it reminded me that they argue now about Chauvet and Lascaux. Chauvet would be a little bit older, but is it 10,000 years older or is it 30,000 years older? And if you look at the paintings, you know, they're not that different. I mean, they're all pretty good, but they're pretty much the same. And so to react to art, to want to make art in that kind of way for a minimum of 10,000 years gives you some thought about the hysteria to find a new way or a different look. And what's probably true is, I don't know if it's all going to look like cream of wheat at the end, but it may all flow together. And the other thing that I would say is that it's a little hard being here with Ellsworth. You know, I'd like to stay competitive, but he is older than I am. But I'm next in line, I think, for when we have it.
But you were always the youngest.
Right. And one of the things I liked best about New York when I came here was it's a friendlier place in a lot of ways than it seems. And going to visit Ellsworth's studio was a pretty big deal. I mean, I had a studio and I was working too, but kind of hard to put it together and worried about what I was doing. But Ellsworth seemed so comfortable. I'd never seen an artist's studio or a way of working. There were a lot of things, all of which were very nice. Everything was kind of under control, and I thought, you know, what's this about? How do you reach that level of equanimity? But that wasn't the whole thing. I mean, there were wonderful individual things, and a lot of things that Ellsworth started that didn't happen until maybe 10 or 15 years later. I mean, there were lots of little ideas, some of which I found use for. But, and it was very nice to have, you know, to have not a return visit to the studio, but I invited, I know one time when things weren't all that great, I showed some drawings that I was thinking about to Ellsworth, and he was able to look at them or just sort of kind of accept them as, yeah, that's really a pretty good idea. And it just was so offhand and so casual that I stopped worrying about it. And then it made it a kind of easy way to go on and to you know, participate, to get into the flow of things. Ellsworth was a wonderful example in just about every way of how to function as an artist.
Can I say something?
Sure.
It was 59 at the Museum of Modern Art, at 16 Americans, and we were each in it because Dorothy Miller. Oh, is that better? Is that really better? Oh, good. What did I say?
You were up to Dorothy Miller.
So when I walked in, I saw Frank's black pictures. I said, oh, this guy has something new. I'd been in New York since 1954, yeah, and this was 59. So it was the middle of the abstract expressionists. That was the scene. And to see Frank's pictures really made me feel like I was doing okay, you know, because, and then I asked Dorothy, I said, I've got to talk to this guy. And so she gave me your telephone number. And I called you and came down, and you were living above a bar with a red light going on all night.
Broome and West Broadway.
And then the next day, I think, I may be wrong, but I think Henry Gelderseller brought you down to see me. And I had just finished a painting, which was red-orange relief. And Frank said, I want to buy that. I said, Frank, I just did it. I can't sell it yet. Well, I should have. Wouldn't that have been nice?
I know how to do it.
I thought I could charge $50 for it maybe at that time. So anyway, but Frank and I would go to galleries together, he remembers. And I remember one time at the Modern, it was an exhibition, and there was a large Leger. And I remember Frank said, there's 100 pictures in there.
Look at.
And I agreed exactly, and I said, yeah, you can take any of them. But then I moved upstate, and I've gone to see his horses, but I really want to see him again very soon.
Sure.
Okay.
I'll be there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good.
I saw some sort of indulgent smiles when I said this is a case where you may see the real New York art community. We had just seen it. Yeah. Now, I would like to add on also to Lynda. Years ago, when I was at Skowhegan and she was a visiting artist, Lynda took a day and turned it into a day and a half and gave the most amazing critiques to young artists. And actually at a dinner party the other day, she gave me one of the best pieces of encouragement I've had in a long time. So this also is this case of how there's transmission from different generations down the line, and I owe different things to pretty much everybody here in that regard. So if Lynda could talk a little bit about.
Well, I feel the same way. I came to New York just after graduating from Tulane, Sophie Newcomb, and really the only contact with abstraction was two monographs, one on de Kooning and one on Gorky in my library, and not much was published on abstraction. I'm talking about in the 60s, early 60s. And I was so excited because I met Barnett Newman and Annalee, and they took me around and they would tell stories like Barney would say, that goddamn Reinhardt's trying to take over the whole minimalist movement, and I was best man at his wedding. So I met Frank through my partner then, Gordon Hart, and for some reason Gordon was short of money, or I was short of money with him. And Frank loaned Gordon, I think, $100 or something like that. And Gordon thought a long time whether or not he wanted to cash the check or not. He looked at it, and he really wanted to keep the signature. And later on, when Frank was on a panel with Barbara Rose, we used to see them around. They were the most glamorous couple you ever saw, but Frank didn't have two front teeth, and I think he deliberately left them out for a while. And she had the big hats, and they were really the star, right? She ended a great essay in Art News. You know, it was Marjorie Morningstar, essentially, and Frank Stella. And they were a great couple, and getting to Ellsworth, when I first really saw the big show that he did at the Guggenheim, and that's a knockout painting, and to see it with Agnes is just incredible. The idea of abstraction in both of these situations, I think, is there. Agnes, I just saw something she did on the internet, and she was saying that there could be 8 interpretations of abstraction, and then I thought about your work when I looked at it. It's such a fact. It's such a fact, the way you do take nature and iconize it in such a way. And I think Frank did it abstractly. You did abstraction from subject to object. And when I saw the black paintings as well, it was when I first arrived. I was knocked out. I didn't know how to interpret that. But when Frank said, somebody asked him at the panel, what did you do to make that object? And everybody was so cavalier then about abstraction. And you said, I just turned a 2x4 on its side and it became the frame. And I said, you know, and then I asked Louette, are you surprised sometime? Yes, I'm surprised, you know, when he ordered it up. You know, he would draw and then he would decide he was going to make a sculpture and then he would order it. And then Judd, I just ordered them in all the different colors. He was saying that at the same time Stella said, just turn the 2x4 on its side. So that was the beginning of process for me. I thought, okay, that's the cavalier gesture, but what does that mean? I didn't want to push paint around with a broom. I didn't want to dump it with a bucket exactly. How can I carry something beyond the frame? And there was so much about the frame or not the frame. And then there were the minimalists over there, totally rococo, out there on the limb, totally out there. And then, you know, of course, the concrete poet, and there were people like Baltasari. I shared the class with him over in California. And there was humor, there was an edge, and there was always humor in work. But the two of them together is such an iconic statement. And I know you were friends. And I took so much from that time from friends such as Frank. And everything was out in the open, and it was so serious. The NYU was packed at that time. People came to hear the word. So I began to experiment with what paint could do and pigmenting. And I began to pour, but first I made some icons and paint, my own paint, and wax paintings. And I began to paint, and then I began to pour, and then I began to, again, find a medium. And then I began to want to make form in the pouring. And now I just want to make things that can function in relationship to an environment. I've always wanted that. I've always wanted something to speak back and forth, texturally, gesturally, still describing an edge, some gestalt, something with motion, something that gives a gesture that emotes. I think emoting is the big thing right here.
Tell us how you did it with the foam.
Oh.
You left out the good part.
I'm still working with polyurethane, and polyurethane comes in many kinds of disguises. Now I'm working with the plastic foam, translating it into another image, translucent. Looks like translucent crystals, glass, and recently I did a fountain called the Pink Lady, and I'm going to show it at the Phillips in Washington. And there's actually a triangle of these stacked pieces and foam. How I got to the foam, I think my father used to run around with a lot of Cuban cigar boxes in his car, and he was a materials person. And in that car, there was also all kinds of pieces of, it was called Benglis Sash and Door in Lake Charles, Louisiana. So I saw all kinds of materials in that car and in his office, and his office was piled high. So I always felt very connected to materials, building materials. He didn't want to be a contractor or out on the job. He'd studied at Tulane and was a football player that, because he knew Greek, he also could learn Latin really easily and get into Tulane, but he had a football scholarship. So I was lucky enough to have had a father that was pretty successful in business, so I became a materialist, that's it. That's it.
Okay. I'm going to... I want to throw out a question, but lead into it with a little anecdote and a little salute, and it's to Frank. When I was a young saber-toothed art critic, I got into an argument with Frank over the Norton lectures, and I learned more from arguing with him than he can know and than I have ever said to him. So I would like to thank him for having done something that used to be done a lot in the community of artists, particularly of abstract artists, which is to throw out things, raw meat, that you could fight and argue about, that abstraction moved forward by people taking positions and by people pushing back. And my question is whether that really exists now or whether it is useful now or whatever, but I will say this as the last part of the anecdote, which is thanks to a dear friend, a wonderful Frank STELLA print. And my daughter, who is an architect, has said to me, "Daddy, can I have that in my bedroom?" And now I'm in a crisis because I'm going to have to steal it back from her. So the tradition is going down the generational scales as well. So with that as the sort of personal anecdote, I'd just like to ask if you think as artists now that the kind of position taking, manifesto writing, argumentation that were so important to abstraction in the teens and 20s of the 20th century and periodically thereafter are still a factor in the way that people think about making art.
I probably would have to say it's a bit different now. I mean, we live in a pluralist, anything goes time. So it would be hard to really say not that in a world where, you know, that sounds, saying not that is more reactionary than contemporary. That being said, there is still the need to find resistance somewhere, to find a way, because I believe today artists work at, say even abstractly, artists working in this mode are working from a position of individualism or individuality, trying to find a means to speak their world and their reality through the forms that they choose, whether it's ceramics, sculpture, painting, so on. So I think that you have to find some resistance somewhere, even if it's not in the fisticuffs of the cedar bar. It's going to be a different kind of resistance, a different way of engaging that resistance.
But I think that there still is a lot of argument over what part of a conversation is valuable, or what can be valuable, or what is necessary, so there's still a big idea of like what some people perceive as shit and others perceive as not, and something that does something else. And I think that still exists, and you just have a much more kind of broken up, it seems, or kind of
certain arguments are more important than others,
or just a much more kind of various terrain of that, of what different communities value, what happens, and what might be important in conversations in certain neighborhoods in New York City are very different from other neighborhoods, and I think when you look at other cities in Europe or in North Africa, you have very different conversations, and so I think that, you know, and I think that always existed in that way, but I think that you really have, you know, you have that type of, this idea that the art world has just shifted in such a different way. It's so much more fractured and so much more kind of diverse in this other.
There's a universal situation. And I don't know if Barney Newman's statement about art is to artists as ornithology as to birds.
Right.
I mean, one has to think about that now.
Yeah.
You know, are we all birds?
Well, let me throw it out this way. I mean, you know, once upon a time in New York, there was a thing called the mainstream, and it was basically the transmission of a European tradition to these shores, and it was seemingly a fairly tidy affair and a fairly identifiable transition. Now, a lot of what's going on is people are rediscovering that really art was being made all kinds of places of which they were relatively unaware, and that particularly in terms of abstraction, the contribution of people from Venezuela, from Brazil, from Argentina, et cetera, and Central Europe and Eastern Europe and so on. And then, of course, of traditions which have abstract art that isn't called that, but again, African and other parts of the world, that has changed our perceptions dramatically. And I wondered how you perceive that in terms of relation to what you do, or what you think these arguments, the more productive ones, might be.
Oh, for me, it's just liberating, really. I mean, I went to school in the 80s, and so I was still dealing with this, and I went to school in America in the 80s, so for me it was very much this kind of Western-centric, American-centric type of academic education. So when I came to New York City and started to meet other artists from different places in the world and actually learn about these parallel modernisms, these parallel postmodernisms, that was really a liberating experience. I remember encountering people like Olu Ogwibe, Okwuenwezor in the 90s, and working with them, just promoting this type of contemporary African art at that time. and wanting to be able to say that this stuff exists in the same space, not as some annexed art or some kind of secondary situation, but as contemporary as anything else. And really our goal was to ultimately create a work that was called contemporary art, not contemporary African art or contemporary this or that, just contemporary art.
Yeah, I think it's also happened, I go to India a lot, and in India, always the music and the dance was there. And the music seemed to be more advanced than the visual arts. But recently, I've seen the visual arts really have become very dynamic. And I think this is probably, there's a sense of abstraction universally that joins the contemporary feel. And maybe it's kind of a rhythm that happens all over within the countries as they become more secure in that kind of communication. But it does rely on communication, I think. It does rely on the East-West exchange, I think. And as much as you were in France, there was a lot of exchange, and you intuited it. As you said, you looked at that wall and you interpreted it. And I think interpretation is a very important thing.
When Ellsworth and I met each other in Venice, he said to me, I remember he said to me, my work is before the war, and your work is after the war. And it meant a lot of different things to me. And I felt, for me, it's essentially, when I look at how I learned about art, Western art, and about abstraction in school, and then experiencing it in my practice in New York, there was always this notion of the contest. There was always like this kind of warfare within the prospects of abstraction, within the focus of abstraction. And it's something that I think today, for myself at least, I don't know about for anybody else, for myself, I don't feel that warfare anymore. For me, it ultimately came, what's abstraction, and does it actually even exist? When I can look at a line going across a canvas and see it as a horizon, or I can see it as a thought, or as an emotional space. And so for me, it always comes from some real sense of the real, whatever that might be for one person versus another. And with Ellsworth, I look at the work and I see his ability to look at nature, shadows, light, time, and to be able to get to this essential space, essential form to depict that experience of looking, you know.
I think some people are involved with icons, and some people are involved with both space, contained space. If, for instance, Frank, I think you invented abstraction and planar iconography in a different way that I responded to, I know. And I couldn't figure it out until I got to the phone, I think. Because then I could make planes which were curves, and they could kind of refer to that kind of composition that we all know. I mean, certainly you weren't a cubist. You were doing different things with different colors and different planes in a different way. And how you arrived at that concentric sort of black paintings, too. How did you do that? What happened? What made you think of it?
It was just a preppy prank, but I mean...
Prank?
Yeah, I don't think it was about that, but I think you raised a really good point, which is that, it's all, in one way or another, the Museum of Modern Art just had a show which told us what it was all about, which was Cubism. And so Cubism and abstraction grew up together. But Lynda raises a really kind of interesting point, which is you could say that it's about plane geometry, and you could, if you wanted to be tricky, you could say minimalism is just the translation of plane geometry, objectifying it. They got as far as solid geometry. But in the end, there are other geometries which you all know, but the most common one would be that of the curved differential geometry and topology of curved surfaces and all of that. And interestingly enough, that's been around in 20th century art a lot, but you don't, and it was reminded me of Alfred Barr's diagram, in which on one side you end up in the year I was born, 1936, with geometric abstract art, and on the other side you have non-geometric abstract art. And the geometric abstract art consists of surrealism, among other things, and Dada. And I only bring it up because of what Lynda said. If I could think of my least favorite artist, I'd probably have to say Dali. I mean, he just pretty much stands for about just as how trashy can you get. And yet, and yet Dali is certainly one of the more inventive artists, and if anything drives abstraction now, it's what President Obama says will save our economy, which is 3D printing. And you'll see that almost everyone who's involved in working in 3 dimensions in that way uses it to do what you can do digitally, basically, in 3 dimensions, which is to draw curves, make surfaces that are complicated in a relatively easy way. So if you have, with Dali, if you just take the limp watch, that's a whole kind of geometry of which has now become everyday. And if you want to think about a more abstract geometry than even differential geometry, you can think about the hypercube. And so Dali, for one reason or another, and surrealism, which is would normally be the, would represent the opposite of what abstract art is about, is actually at a more sophisticated geometrical level than abstraction was in the early 30s. And the other version of that, besides Dali, a more palatable version, might be the painting at the Museum of Modern Art of the Picasso of the balloon women over the floating over the horizon, in which you have the curved shapes, and you could imagine them filled with foam.
Well, I like the linear curves that you're doing with your space on your pieces there. What year were those?
Probably last year. I don't know. Anyway, I've been, I mean.
I like that it's a different kind of drawing that you're doing now.
Yeah, if it were full disclosure, I'd say it's 3D printing. I mean, we call it rapid prototyping, but I mean, it's basically 3D printing.
Well, just let me say that towards the end of his life, Donald Judd added a couple of essays to a body of essays which had previously been published. Maybe, Frank, it's time for you to add some chapters to Working Space, because the great premise of Working Space was that the reason abstraction wasn't done was that there was more space to conquer, more space to claim. So maybe chapters 7, 8, or 9.
Not from me.
Okay. Okay, maybe we should open it up to the room and see if anybody has comments or questions. It's a ripe opportunity.
Everybody wants to have a drink.
There's one back there. Yep.
What would you tell a 10-year-old who says, I want to become an artist?
The mothers speak first.
No. You have had 10-year-olds.
I can only, it's hard to say. I mean, I wouldn't tell a 10-year-old anything, because I mean, I don't know that they have, I don't remember them ever asking me any questions. But the only interesting thing, actually, to me, I don't know if it's what you're getting at, 10 years old is kind of tricky, because the kids can make art and do art without any trouble. But by the time, as they develop, maybe 6, 7, they start to get self-conscious about it, and then it becomes totally something else. But by and large, making art is not hard for anybody, unless you think about it.
Okay, I think that's a great place to stop.